Hi everyone, my name is Brandon Foster. I'm a researcher with the REL Northeast Islands at the Education Development Center in Waltham, Massachusetts. On behalf of my colleagues here today, we want to welcome you all to this exciting and timely bridge event. We would also like to extend a special thank you to all of the individuals joining us from various time zones, as we know for some of you it is quite early. Our bridge event today is titled The Path Forward to Support the Early Education Workforce, National Policies and Examples from Vermont. Based on the poll results and registration information, it seems like we're joined by a very diverse cross-section of early childhood professionals. We hope you find this topic timely and relevant to your work. Let's look at the agenda for today's bridge event. We will first get to know our speakers and goals for the session today. You will then hear about some findings from the Early Childhood Workforce Index. We will then have a 15-minute facilitated Q&A based on that work, where we encourage everybody to be active in the chat box. Next, we will hear from Vermont about some of the challenges and successes they are facing in implementing a universal pre-K program in their state. We'll hold a 10-minute Q&A relevant to that work, and we'll end with some closing remarks. Our work today came about through a collaboration between a research alliance and partnership in our region. First, the research alliance that has influenced this work is our Early Childhood Workforce Development Research Alliance. This alliance brings together the region's early childhood leaders to gather evidence to refine programs and policies with the goal of increasing early childhood teachers' degree attainment, credentials, and compensation, as well as strengthening professional development plans and activities in the region. This work has also been influenced by the Vermont Universal Pre-K Research Partnership. The partnership includes members from both state agencies that oversee Vermont's Universal Pre-Kindergarten program, the Agency of Education and the Agency of Human Services. The partnership plans to address the research needs present during implementation of the Universal Pre-K model. As such, the partnership plans to inform Vermont's ongoing policy and practice decisions for the program. Our goals for today's event are as follows. First, we will highlight recent research in the area of early childhood workforce development through the dissemination of findings from the Early Childhood Workforce Index. These findings will foster a discussion related to the challenges and opportunities raised by these findings. We will then build knowledge about how specific implications relate to Vermont's implementation of the Universal Pre-Kindergarten model. Our speakers today are Dr. McLean. Caitlin serves as the lead researcher for the State of the Early Childhood Workforce Initiative at the Center for the Study of Childcare Employment at the University of California, Berkeley. This specific project provides state-by-state data on the status of those working in the early childhood education and care sector via an influential biennial report, a fantastic interactive website, and periodic data snapshots and policy briefs. Melissa Riegel-Garrett. Melissa is the director of the statewide Systems and Community Collaborations Unit at the Child Development Division of the Vermont Department for Children and Families. In her role, Melissa leads and provides programmatic, educational, and administrative leadership and development across the state. Tierney O'Mara. Tierney is currently the Universal Pre-K Coordinator for Vermont's Agency of Education. Previously, Tierney worked in Head Start and Early Head Start in a variety of administrative and staff roles. And for the last 3 years, she was co-coordinator of Vermont's QRIS. You will hear from Melissa and Tierney when we discuss the Vermont Universal Pre-K program in the second half of today's event. So with that said, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Caitlin McLean to present some findings from the Early Childhood Workforce Index.
Thank you, Brandon, and hello and welcome everybody. As Brandon mentioned, today I'll be sharing some findings from our Early Childhood Workforce Index, which is co-authored by myself and my colleagues at the Center for the Study of Childcare Employment, Dr. Marcy Whitebook and Dr. Leah Austin. And the index is a cross-state analysis of working conditions and policies related to the early childhood workforce, where we look at all 50 states and DC. But our research center has for nearly 20 years been involved in policy-oriented research to shine a spotlight on our nation's early childhood workforce and the important work that they do for families and children. We know that evidence over the last quarter century has demonstrated that programs with well-prepared, well-supported, and well-compensated teachers are those most likely to deliver early learning experiences that support children's development and help them succeed in school and beyond, and which are most likely to help teachers to hone their practice over time. In recognition of the crucial importance of skilled teachers to providing effective early education, the Institute of Medicine and National Research Council put out a consensus report called Transforming the Workforce for Children Birth through Age 8, which lays out advances in neuroscience about what helps children learn, as well as the importance of having skilled early educators to facilitate that learning. The report emphasized the need for access to foundational knowledge for all of those working with young children birth to age 8, and a minimum of a bachelor's degree for lead teachers in particular. Crucially, the report also acknowledged the importance of teachers' well-being, in addition to adequate preparation, in order to deliver on the promise of high-quality early learning experiences for children. And yet, despite the best efforts of those involved in the system, we continue to confront inadequate policies, and we lack the financing mechanisms required to deliver the best of what we know is possible. And instead, poor employment conditions for early educators remain the norm. What you're seeing here are some infographics developed from a 2014 report by our research center, Worthy Work, Still Unlivable Wages, which documented over the past 25 years or so the stagnant wages and poor working conditions of many of those providing early care and education to our nation's youngest children. Disrupting this status quo requires a willingness to engage in more critical assessment of our approach to quality improvement and the acceptance that effective teaching is dependent on the conditions under which educators work, their well-being, and their skills and knowledge. Our center's Worthy Work report was very much a national policy document, but we know that much of the action in early care and education policy, as well as education policy more generally, happens at the state and local levels. And so not quite 2 years ago, we launched what we at the center call our State of the Early Childhood Workforce Initiative, with the goal of documenting and tracking over time state efforts to improve the preparation, support, and reward of early childhood educators. The Early Childhood Workforce Index is the centerpiece of this initiative. The first index, which I'll be talking to you about today, was released a little over a year ago, and we're currently in the planning stages for the next edition to be released in summer 2018, the idea being that we'll release this index every 2 years to track progress. At the same time, in addition to the index report, we also developed a variety of associated tools, such as an interactive map and individual state profiles, to encourage use of the findings from the report. I also want to briefly mention that the initiative involves a series of deeper dive research projects, which you can see listed here. In particular, I've included a link to some materials that we've completed over the past year, which analyze recent movement toward parity in compensation for publicly funded pre-K teachers as compared with K-3 teachers. And in fact, just this month, we released the final report in this series, which looks in depth at 5 states and 2 cities which have implemented parity policies in their communities. And I'll just mention this briefly a bit later in the presentation as well. But I also wanted to highlight some of the other topics that you can look forward to over the next year. So a quick word on who we're talking about when we speak about the Early Childhood Workforce Index. In our first edition, we specifically focused on teaching staff, providing early education and care services to children from birth to prior to kindergarten. And we know that nationally, about 2 million, mostly women, and disproportionately women of color, are directly engaged in providing early care and education services, whether in schools, centers, or homes, with about 1 million in centers specifically. So these data that you see here are from one of our infographics, and it's specifically from the 2012 National Survey of Early Care and Education. And so included in here is, of course, public pre-kindergarten teachers working with 3- and 4-year-olds, as well as other preschool teachers, but also early educators serving younger kids. And overall, teachers delivering publicly funded pre-kindergarten make up a relatively small part of the overall early educator workforce. Estimates from this national survey suggest that only about 6% of the 1 million center-based teachers are employed in schools, and a further 21% work in other centers which receive pre-K funding, which means that up to about a quarter of those 1 million center-based teachers could potentially be classified as pre-K teachers specifically, with a wider percentage of center-based teachers serving children ages 3 to 5, but not in receipt of public pre-K funds. I also want to mention that our center recently put out a brief and comparison chart of key characteristics of the K-12 workforce and the early childhood workforce. And I don't have time to mention that comparison in any depth today, so I've included the link for those of you who might be interested. In terms of our early childhood workforce index, I want to mention that it's organized around 3 major themes. First, earnings and economic security, where we describe the current status of early educator earnings both nationally and across all 50 states and DC. But we also know that states vary considerably in their efforts to improve working conditions to support the workforce. And so we look at the status of state policies in 2 major areas. In the second section, early childhood workforce policies, we're just looking at those policies within early childhood. And then in this third section, family and income support policies, we've also looked at other state policies that may have been implemented for families and workers, but aren't directly targeted at the early childhood workforce. So that includes things like minimum wage legislation or paid time off from work. For the purposes of this webinar, I'll be talking mostly about a few examples from the first 2 sections of the index. So within this first section of the report, Earnings and Economic Security, we provide both national and cross-state data on wages for early educators using data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And so we report things like median wages for early educators compared to other occupations, especially other education occupations. And we also looked at changes in wages over time, and I'll show you an example of that in a second. And then lastly, I want to mention for about 17 states for which we had data available, we also reported participation rates in a series of federal public income support programs, such as Medicaid and food stamps. What you're seeing here is a screenshot from our interactive mapping tool showing the change in wages, inflation adjusted, over a 5-year period specifically for childcare workers. Now, I want to be clear that this data is from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which classifies the early childhood workforce into one of 2 categories, preschool teachers or childcare workers. Preschool teachers meaning anybody who works with 3- and 4-year-olds, not limited to those working in state-funded pre-kindergarten programs. And childcare workers, meaning sort of everybody else. So it could include infant toddler teachers, but it could also include those working with school-age children outside school hours. And so we're sort of limited to this classification by the data. And as you can see looking at this map, not only are these women typically low paid, but in most states, they've had no growth, and in fact, a decrease in their wages over a 5-year period. So in 2015, across the nation, childcare workers earned a median hourly wage of $9.77, and that was actually a 3% loss in real wages from 2010. And as a result, among this group of childcare workers, 46%, or nearly half, reside in families that participate in one or more public income support programs, such as Medicaid, food stamps, or the Earned Income Tax Credit. And I want to mention that this is nearly double the rate of workers across occupations. Now, if you actually went to our website and went to the map, you can click on any of the states to see specific state information. So, for example, in Vermont, you can see on the right there the 2015 median wages for childcare workers compared with preschool teachers and kindergarten teachers. And on the left, it's showing specifically the change over time in median wages for childcare workers. Now this is a screenshot of the map showing this time preschool teacher earnings. And if we look at preschool teacher earnings, we see a somewhat happier picture. Wages increased in many more states, although not all, and in some cases this increase was substantial, at 20% or more. And we're still exploring what exactly is driving these increases. But we think that at least part of the explanation may be the expansion of state-funded pre-K programs over the past few years. Because we know that teachers tend to be better paid in these programs compared with other early educators. And in particular, several states have actually been working toward explicitly ensuring that their pre-K teachers be paid in line with elementary school teachers. However, really unpicking sort of what's driving these changes in individual states will require further exploration using state-level data. And as shown previously, if you visit the mapping tool on our website, you can click on any of the states to view specific wage data for that state. Now, as mentioned, the index also looks at state policy efforts. In order to focus attention on what's needed to adequately prepare, support, and compensate the early childhood workforce, we came up with what we call the 5 essential elements of early childhood workforce policy: qualification requirements, work environments and supports, such as paid planning time, which in our first edition of the index we look at in relation to QRIS standards, compensation strategies, financial resources, specifically state efforts to marshal funds for ECE, and then lastly, workforce data. Now the reason we chose these 5 elements in particular is because for qualifications, we know that adequate preparation and access to foundational knowledge is necessary for teachers to develop the skills to provide high-quality learning experiences. We also know that workplace supports, such as paid planning time and paid time for professional development, are needed to ensure ongoing reflection, development, and educator well-being in the workplace. And we focus on compensation strategies because adequate pay and some measure of economic security are indispensable if we want to attract and retain skilled educators. Additionally, making progress in each of these 3 key areas requires building solid foundations for these policies by first securing sufficient financial resources, and second, collecting quality, comprehensive workforce data in order to be able to test the effectiveness of policies and to ensure the good use of public dollars. And so within the index, we devised a series of measurable indicators, things that we could look at across all 50 states and DC, and then within each of these essential elements. And then depending on where states fall along these indicators, they receive an overall assessment of stalled, edging forward, or making headway for each element. And the overall takeaway is that state policies are out of line with research recommendations on what it takes to adequately support the early childhood workforce. And although we looked at only whether states had policies in place and not at the success of implementation or the impact of these policies, and although we set indicators often at less than what might be considered ideal policies, still no state was making headway or the highest tier for all 5 elements of early childhood workforce policy. and barely half the states were making headway in any of the essential elements, meaning that there is room for improvement in every state. Now, as an example, our first policy element was qualification requirements. Each state sets their own qualification standards for early educators, and minimum requirements vary widely, not only across states, but within states, according to setting and source of funding. States have been making greater progress toward raising educational requirements for publicly funded pre-K teachers serving children aged 3 to 4, particularly those working in public schools. But they still lag far behind in minimum requirements for early educators working outside the public pre-K system. Of the 44 states, including DC, and remember that this is based on 2016 data collection, with public pre-K programs at the time of our data collection, 23 required a minimum of a bachelor's degree for teachers, regardless of setting. An additional 14 states required a bachelor's for some pre-K teachers in certain types of programs or settings, most often those in public schools only. But 7 states didn't require a bachelor's degree for any pre-K teachers. And these uneven qualifications are in sharp contrast to the standard requirement of a BA and licensure for K-3 teachers across states. For early educators working outside the pre-K system, only 11 states set a minimum requirement of at least a Child Development Associate credential or completion of a substantive vocational program within their licensing requirements. Most states require only a high school diploma. Moreover, too many states require nothing at all. 10 states have no requirements for teaching staff in centers, and 23 states have no requirements for home-based settings with 2 or more providers. And so we know that this variation in educational requirements results in great inequities for children. For example, in different states, sometimes even within the same state, 4-year-olds who are eligible to attend a publicly subsidized early childhood program may be taught by someone with the equivalent of a master's degree or by a teacher with no college background at all. In terms of the index, states which met both of these indicators, a minimum of a bachelor's degree for lead pre-K teachers and at least a CDA or equivalent for all licensed providers, were assessed at the highest tier, making headway. And so as you can see here, only 5 states are at that top tier in green. 24 states met the criteria for one but not both, which is yellow or edging forward, and then the rest, nearly half, met neither indicator. And as before, if you visit our website, you can click to view individual state information. And yet, minimum qualification requirements is actually a policy element where states have made more progress relative to some other areas that we track in the index. Where we're doing less well is with regard to work environments, financial resources, and especially compensation strategies. And so for my second example, let's talk about the compensation strategies policy element. We chose 2 measurable indicators, salary parity for pre-K teachers and a wage supplement for early educators more broadly. And the vision is that compensation across the early childhood field would be in line with educators of older children, in recognition of the fact that early education requires just as much skill and training. Currently, however, we're still very far from this goal. There are wide disparities in earnings, not only between early educators and educators of elementary and older children, but also among early educators themselves, with those in school settings receiving higher compensation than those in center or home-based settings. And so, because states are nowhere near optimal, we chose indicators and defined making headway relative to where states are now. And the closest that any state policy efforts come to substantially raising the base pay of early educators is in publicly funded pre-K programs. And so we assess states based on whether or not they require, at a minimum, salary parity for all of their publicly funded pre-K teachers. And I say at a minimum because compensation parity really should entail attention to benefits and working conditions more generally. For example, including paid time for professional responsibilities, such as planning or attending professional development opportunities. But we didn't want to set the bar too high for this initial addition. But because we're trying to spur progress, we did set some criteria to guide states. So in order to get credit for this indicator, states had to require parity for both starting salary and some sort of salary scale or schedule which allows for regular salary increases over time. And further, it had to be required for all settings, not just teachers in public schools, and for all state-funded pre-K programs in their state, as some states have more than one. But this is still short of the optimal because we didn't assess states based on parity and benefits, and we only looked at lead teachers. Yet even so, only a handful of states met the criteria for this indicator. For those of you who may be interested in this topic, as I mentioned earlier, our center has put out a series of materials looking at compensation parity for pre-K teachers in more detail. The series includes a brief, which lays out a framework for understanding compensation parity, as well as a summary of where states are currently, and also a longer report which describes the current parity landscape across all of the states. And then, as I also mentioned, we have a new report which looks at 5 states and 2 cities which have made some progress in this area, really trying to examine what policies they put in place and how they've gotten there, including moving toward better compensation for their pre-K teachers in community-based settings. But in terms of our second compensation indicator in the index, we looked at whether or not states have a wage supplement program for early educators more generally, not just pre-K teachers. And we want to emphasize that this is not because we don't think that increased compensation should be a priority across the entire early childhood field. We do. However, to date, there have been few state initiatives which attempt to directly raise base pay for early educators outside the pre-K system. We've seen that collective bargaining is one strategy that has seen success, for example, in New York. And there have been some local initiatives which try to raise base pay for early educators outside the pre-K system. But in terms of state policy, normally what we've seen is something that we refer to as a wage supplement, usually a stipend or a tax credit, which aims to increase early educators' income, typically between a few hundred to potentially a few thousand per year. But it doesn't directly raise their wages. Now again, this is a cross-state map of the assessment of this policy element, compensation strategies. And as before, the assessment was simple. Both indicators means making headway, at least one edging forward, and none stalled. And you can see that Oklahoma was, at the time, the only state which was assessed as making headway. But actually, due to budget cuts, they lost a key compensation initiative in their state. And so it remains to be seen whether there have been more losses versus gains since the first report was released. But we'll have a better sense of that this summer when the next edition of the index is released. But I think the Oklahoma example really points toward the fact that moving forward on compensation will require rethinking our strategies in other areas of early childhood policy as well, coming back to those 5 essential elements I mentioned earlier. In particular, we know that increased funding levels and innovative funding mechanisms will be necessary to ensure ongoing sustainable pay increases for early educators in order to transform early childhood jobs into attractive, desirable jobs in the 21st century. And so a key question for us is how to continue the progress we've made so far in terms of qualifications and educational attainment, while also spurring progress in other areas of workforce policy. And toward that goal, we've set out a list of concrete policy recommendations for each of our 5 essential elements of early childhood workforce policy, which you can see listed here and in our executive summary on our website. But in addition to these specific recommendations, we also developed a set of principles, which are shown here in blue. And these can be used to guide reform efforts in early care and education more broadly. These include, first of all, amplifying educator voice and informing decision-making. At all stages, we need to ask, are the people most intimately involved in the work at the table, and do they have an active voice? In terms of pre-K, do pre-K teachers have a seat at the table in K-12 discussions? And do K-12 colleagues, particularly leadership, have the understanding of ECE and relevant skills to take that information forward? Second, increasing consistency and reducing fragmentation. We have to ask ourselves, are our reform efforts and proposals adding to or simplifying the complexity of the existing early childhood system? Third, providing opportunity and ensuring access. As you seek to make changes to the early childhood system in your community, are current members of the workforce provided with the necessary supports and resources to stay engaged and to have opportunities for advancement? At the center, we have a body of research related to the supports that have previously been shown to be highly successful in assisting the current workforce to engage in and successfully complete higher education, including financial assistance, as well as flexible scheduling, academic and English language supports. The lesson here and across the principles being you don't have to start from scratch. A fourth principle, maintaining diversity but disrupting stratification. We know that nearly 40% of early educators are from historical minority groups, which approaches the child population in which about 50% also represent historical minority groups. This diversity should be lauded as a strength. And yet, existing reports, and we're also in the process of conducting new analyses on this subject at our center, reveal that people of color in ECE are disproportionately concentrated in lower status and lower paying jobs in certain settings, and as a result, have limited representation in administrator and director roles, as well as other leadership and decision-making roles in the field, including those that sit at policy tables. And so, this inequity has implications for whose perspectives and voices are and are not reflected in decisions about early education, from the classroom to boardrooms to the tables where policies are made. And so, as you go forth, the principle is to remind you to continue to ask yourself who is not at the table, what voices might be marginalized or missing, and how can your strategies disrupt current stratification? This question in particular lends itself to exploring how this principle matters for K-3 and what are the bidirectional challenges and learning opportunities. Finally, our last principle, assuring sustainability and dedicating sufficient resources. We have to be realistic. The existing setup can't support a high-quality early care and education system that's accessible to all children and families, or even in its current state, to those most in need of it. Transforming early childhood jobs requires transforming wider early childhood policies and infrastructure and embracing early care and education as a public good. States making headway demonstrate that the potential to make progress is within our grasp, and it's our hope that the appraisal offered in this first edition of the index, accompanied by ours and others' work in this area, will strengthen those efforts making headway and stimulate reform towards sustainable policies and revenue sources going forward. So thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Caitlin. Your presentation was very informative, and it provides a baseline of knowledge for building upon for the 2018 release. That'll be very interesting to do a comparison. I'm Jackie Barassa, facilitator of the Early Childhood Workforce Development Research Alliance. I'll be moderating this Q&A session, and I would like to begin with a question that was submitted during registration, and one that's actually personally important to me. So, Caitlin, has there been any research on bilingual or dual language early education workers?
Thanks, Jackie. So this is a great question. We've seen that there's been an increased focus on bilingual and dual language learners at the child's age. So, for example, the Migration Policy Institute has just put out some great research on that, and I know that the Near Yearbook has done some research on that as well. However, I feel like there's still a great gap in our understanding of dual language among early education workers. I know that there's limited information, for example, in the National Survey of Early Care and Education, which is one of the main sources that we've used to understand the workforce. And it suggests that a little over of a quarter of our center-based staff speak a language other than English, and that this is even more common among aides and assistants compared with lead teachers. And so I have to say that we know that this is an important issue, and yet there's just not quite that level of research kind of digging into the implications of this. But thank you, great question.
So is there any, and this is just a follow-up from me personally because I'm interested, do you think there'll be any information that's reported in the 2018 index? I mean, have you changed any of your research questions to include this, or I'm just curious?
Yeah, that's a great question. So as mentioned, there's that kind of very limited information in the national survey, and I think that's something that we'll definitely report, because part of the idea of the index is that even though it's state-level information where we really focus on state policies, we do have a whole section at the beginning which is sort of about the workforce. And so in the first edition, we presented some very baseline information about qualifications and wages and race ethnicity across the workforce at the national level. And so for the 2018 index, we've been thinking about how to update this, given that we don't have more recent data yet, but actually kind of exploring some of those questions about diversity that I mentioned earlier. And so definitely languages spoken will be part of this. But I think a key issue is more generally a lack of data on our workforce. So we collect a ton of information about children attending programs, and we collect a fair amount of information about the program itself, but we're still working on actually collecting and reporting data on the workforce. And so until we kind of move that a little bit more, I think we're always going to be a little bit challenged to address some of these issues for the workforce in particular.
Thank you, Caitlin. Another question, and this one will be particularly interesting, I think, to some of our audience because they actually work for Head Start, but does Head Start fit into this early childhood discussion? And if it does, where does it fit, do you think?
Great question. So Head Start absolutely fits into the early childhood discussion. They're a key element of our early childhood system. And in terms of our index, Head Start features, but not explicitly, as a kind of distinct entity, meaning that we didn't call out Head Start specific data or policies, in part because we're focused on state-level efforts, and Head Start is, of course, a federal program. That being said, we absolutely consider Head Start and early Head Start teachers part of the ECE workforce and think that supportive preparation, work environments, and compensation should apply regardless of setting or program funding. And then in terms of the data that we report, Head Start teachers are included in both the national NSECE data and the state-level BLS data, but it's not broken out. And so in the BLS data, for example, that's just not possible. They don't report anything on setting or program funding, but they are there.
Thank you. I don't see any questions coming in from our participants, so I will ask you another question that was submitted at registration. Is there a particular strategy that sticks out in your mind to pay teachers for higher credentials?
So that's a great question. Of course, this is a little bit complex because we know that our ECE sector is very divided by setting, by program funding. So I think the key point is that we really need higher and better public funding in order to really make this work across the early childhood workforce. Currently, many parts of the ECE sector, though not all, of course, are largely based on parent fees, which makes it difficult to really pay the early educators doing this work what they deserve, especially as we've been placing more expectations on them in terms of qualifications. And so I think primarily at the policy level, we need to concentrate on making sure that all public dollars, whether that's CCDF, pre-K, Head Start, etc., are based on cost models that actually look at what it takes to provide these services, and that includes appropriate compensation for teachers with the higher credentials that research recommends that they have.
Very good, thank you. And I know that Claire has prompted people, and I have too, to submit any questions into the chat. And I'll ask one more question. I know we're ahead of schedule, but perhaps people can be thinking and then typing as Melissa and Tierney are actually presenting. So my last question, unless one comes in, will be our Workforce Development Research Alliance is actually very interested in education levels of the workforce. And would you like to say anything about the efforts to subsidize individual courses for leveling up?
Sure. So educational attainment is, of course, a key issue. We've seen a lot of movement in this area, as I mentioned in the presentation, for example. And so one of the key things that we talked about a little bit in the first index, but what we really want to highlight more explicitly in the second round of the index is that it's not enough to just require the workforce to get certain qualifications. That's important, but you really need the supports there. And so there's a variety of things that states have been doing in order to actually support people to get, a CDA, to get a BA, whatever it is. So one key program that many of you are probably familiar with is, of course, the TEACH program. This is a scholarship program that many states, I think about 26 or so, have, which combines sort of financial supports for coursework, but also some sort of, financial award, or in some cases an actual pay raise associated with attaining that next step in their educational ladder. And so this is a really great program. Some states have their own programs for scholarships and similar financial supports. It's not TEACH, and that's helpful as well. And so this is one of the things that we want to look at in a little bit more detail across the states, because we know, of course, that financial support matters, but we also know that non-monetary supports matter as well. So this could be things like mentoring, for example. It could be, tailoring coursework in different ways. So maybe you have it in a different language. Maybe you provide it online as well as in person. And so I think that's definitely a key area and something to look forward to in the next edition.
Thank you, Caitlin. Sounds like there could be some pretty innovative solutions to that. I'm looking at the chat, and it looks like Manuela has actually submitted a question. Could you talk a little more about historical minorities being more represented in lower paying jobs, and whether there's some research on why this may be?
Sure, great question. So this is something that we're actively exploring at our research center right now. One of the great things about that National Survey of Early Care and Education that came out a few years ago is that it actually provided some very in-depth information, not just on kind of the characteristics of the workforce, which includes race, ethnicity, languages spoken, but also where they work. So what settings, what roles they're working in, and so on. And so right now, we're in the midst of analyzing that data to understand to what extent race and ethnicity is associated with individuals in the workforce being in certain roles and what they're being paid, etc. And I don't think it's surprising that we see this stratification by race ethnicity where, for example, people of color tend to be, assistants, tend to be paid less, tend to be working, for example, with infants and toddlers rather than the higher paid positions with preschoolers, because we also see this more generally in our labor market. But I think the reason that we're trying to draw attention to it with our new analysis, which again we're still working on, so this isn't published yet, is that we think that the diversity in our workforce is a strength, and that as we go forward, we should maintain that diversity. But we need to be thinking about how do we not just maintain it, but how do we make sure that this current stratification that we're seeing is disrupted so that people of color have absolutely every opportunity to move into lead teacher positions, to move into directorships, and to continue on if they wanted to move sort of into other leadership positions, whether at the policy level or similar. And so I don't have all the answers yet because, like I said, we're still doing this analysis, but it's something we're working on and we'll be sharing over the next year or so.
And I'm certainly sure that our audience would be very interested in the release of that information. Elizabeth has given us one more question. So if you'll bear with me, transforming the workforce report addresses ages birth through 8, but the index only looks at up to age 5. Any future plans to look closer at school-aged care?
Another great question. So that's one of the things that we've heard back from folks over the past year as we've been planning this next edition. And so we're thinking about how we might include school age in the index. Originally, we limited it to 0 to 5, in part because of the national survey that we had, the data that we had, and the fact that we still see this kind of bifurcation in state policies where people tend to be thinking about 0 to 5 rather than the whole spectrum, depending on which sector you're in. Obviously, childcare tends to focus more on school age. And so it's a little bit tricky because we're always limited by what data we have. But it's something that we're thinking about, and so stay tuned. But we'll be trying to focus more on school age.
Thank you, Caitlin. And you'll be staying on until the end of this webinar, correct? In case
Absolutely.
any more questions come in? Okay,
Yes.
So rather than prolong looking for more questions, you can take a breath now and put yourself on mute if you'd like. And I'd like to turn everything over now to our presenters from Vermont. And Tierney will actually begin. So let me just move that slide. There it is. Okay, Tierney, you're on. I'm muting myself.
Great. Thank you, Jackie. Again, my name is Tierney O'Mara, and I'm the Universal Pre-K Coordinator for Vermont at the Vermont Agency of Education. As you can see, pre-K in Vermont did not start with Act 166. Here you see a brief timeline of Vermont's universal pre-K system, and Vermont has a long history, over just about 30 years of supporting early learning and pre-K education. And you can see, starting from Act 68 in 1987, we've moved to 2014. Pre-K moved from 1987 to voluntary. In 2006, created a stronger commitment of studying the pre-K system, which led to Act 166, which created mandatory access for pre-K through parent choice. The purpose of Act 166 is to provide each and every 3-, 4-, and 5-year-old not eligible for kindergarten in Vermont with opportunities to reach their full growth and developmental potential through voluntary universal access to high-quality pre-kindergarten education. Pre-K enrollment from FY15, FY16, and FY17, you can really see the highlight of the increase of participation of children who are accessing universal pre-K in Vermont. In FY15, it was a partial implementation year, so there were early adopters for programs in Vermont, and other programs had the option of another year to prepare themselves. In the fall of 2016 was Vermont's first year of full implementation of universal pre-K. And at that time, all school districts were mandated to offer a pre-kindergarten education that includes enrollment and participation as a family choice. It is not a requirement. Publicly funded universal pre-K is offered in our local public schools, Head Start programs, pre-qualified community-based childcare programs. This includes also registered home providers, licensed home providers, and licensed childcare centers. Vermont's statewide tuition rate paid on behalf of children attending pre-K in FY17 is $3,178. And pre-kindergarten education is defined in Vermont as 10 hours per week, 35 weeks per year of the academic school year. Vermont's universal pre-K teaching standards, I'm going to dive into this a little bit deeper here. Vermont universal pre-K providers must not only meet specific teaching quality standards, but they also must meet programmatic standards. And our teaching standards for universal pre-K are that all programs shall employ or contract for the services of teachers holding a valid Vermont educator license with an endorsement in either early childhood education or early childhood special education. As of October of this year, 2017, we have 380 public and private programs who are pre-qualified to offer a pre-kindergarten education. 245 of those are private community-based programs, and 136 of those are public pre-K programs. In addition to the specific teacher standards that we have for universal pre-K, there are also programmatic standards that program must achieve to be a pre-qualified program. All programs, no matter the setting, have to maintain and show evidence that they are in good regulatory standing with child care licensing, that they have an active child care license, that they are either NACE accredited or hold a specific star rating, which is Vermont's QRIS system. It's called the Vermont Stars. The minimum star level is that programs must have 3 stars with a plan to achieve 4 and 5 stars with 2 points in each arena in 3 years, or be a 4 or 5-star provider with 2 points in each arena, as well as the program's curriculum must align with Vermont's early learning standards. So diving deeper into the teacher standards, district operated or a public school pre-K program, there must be 1 licensed teacher in each pre-kindergarten classroom. In private licensed centers, center-based programs, the pre-kindergarten education requires at least 1 licensed teacher who is present for the 10 hours that coincide with the hours of pre-kindergarten education paid for by tuition from districts. Private registered homes that are pre-qualified, either the provider holds the teaching license or they contract with 1 licensed teacher who is present also for the 10 hours that coincide with the hours of pre-kindergarten education paid for by tuition from the districts, or the provider receives 3 hours per week of regular active supervision and training from a licensed teacher. And this is essentially giving what we have a mixed delivery system, some flexibility in regards to teaching standards. And I'm now going to pass the baton over to my colleague, Melissa Riegel-Garrett, here at the Child Development Division for the Department of Children and Families.
Good afternoon, everyone. Really glad to be able to share with you a little bit more about the implication for Vermont's workforce, really the drivers that we've seen since Universal Pre-K under Act 166 came into effect. When I was listening to Claire share index information on Vermont, I had a little bit of a panic when I saw the data was the pre-K teacher compensation went down, and I quickly realized that that's because it was back in 2015, and it really is before Act 166 came into play. So I'm waiting with bated breath for the next index to be published so we can see what kind of impact this really has had on that particular data point. So in Vermont, we do have a mixed delivery system, as Tierney referenced. We have 380 pre-qualified programs, but those are both public and private-based settings. And with that, we've really seen that tension between public school and the compensation package that they can offer, as well, in tension with our community-based programs. So it's been an interesting trip for us over the last couple of years as we've really tried to wrestle with, the qualifications that were set, and do we have enough qualified licensed teachers in the state to meet the need and the demand of our families, as well as, where are those licensed teachers? And we're really seeing the compensation piece playing a big role in where are licensed teachers wanting to be employed. So as Act 166 came into being, we had a lot of dialogue and anecdotal evidence that our private programs were really struggling to find the teachers to be able to fill the positions they required. We weren't really clear if that was true. So in 2015, we started a licensed teacher capacity work group. We were lucky enough to have some funding under the Early Learning Challenge Grant that really allowed us to play with that and have that piece, opportunity, facilitation, things like that for us to be able to do this. The first thing we did was really grapple with the data. What was very interesting about our data was that when we looked closely and did the math out, given all the complications scenarios that Tierney described, with really only a requirement of one 10-hour-a-week teacher in a private classroom, private center, which could have multiple classrooms in it, versus the public school actually needing that teacher for each classroom that they ran. We really found that mathematically we should have enough licensed teachers in the state. So we were really struggling to figure out why did anecdotally people keep really pushing at us around not being able to find a licensed teacher. What we soon realized was that the data, Kaylin really referred to the limitations of the data. Our endorsements are actually birth through grade 3 endorsements, and so it was really difficult. We didn't actually have the ability to know where those licensed teachers were teaching. So several of them may have actually have jobs in the K through grade 3 world, and without being able to really identify where those teachers were, we were really struggling with being able to pay attention to the data. So with that, in 2016, we actually did a survey that we put out to the field. It was informal, and it went out to about 620 of our high star rated programs. It didn't matter if they were actually part of our system yet or not. What we found out, we had 212 center and home-based programs participate and 70 school-based programs participated, so it was a total of about a 45% response rate. And the big lesson learned from that was that not being able to provide adequate wages and benefits posed the biggest hiring challenge in home and center-based programs. And that while some programs might be able to match school pay, they still had a hard time hiring because they were asking teachers to work more days a week, more hours, and certainly year-round versus calendar year, and some of the other working conditions that Kaylin reported earlier around planning time and things like that. So in 2017, we really had a big conversation about what are the supports that we have in the state and how can we actually start to support our professionals in moving up. What we figured out was that we actually have a fabulous opportunity that was within our alternative pathway to licensure scenario that's under our Agency of Education rules. This group really took a hard look at what are the pathways that are available all the way to licensure that we need, because what we determined was our best bet for getting licensed teachers in our private programs was to actually grow that from within, that it would be really hard to attract and retain teachers that had been working in the public school given that information from the survey about compensation and benefits and working conditions. So we really wanted to look at where our programs maybe had licensed or not licensed educators, but in particular we were really looking at where did programs have teachers that had bachelor's degrees that we could then potentially help them attain a licensure through the non-traditional path, so not going through necessarily higher ed coursework. So in addition to recognizing that there was a lot of energy from a variety of places in supporting these efforts in our field. So we had partners in our higher ed world. All of our higher ed institutions were very interested in tracking this need. And Linden State College developed a new early childhood education licensure program that was an online program and that could in fact support these folks that were seeking licensure that we were trying to grow from within. Almost in parallel, our Agency of Education was really looking at, it wasn't unique to early childhood, but they became a member of the Interstate NASTEC license to license agreement. I regret to say I don't know what those initials actually stand for, so I apologize. But essentially it's an overarching agreement among almost all of the states in the country that basically if one had an early childhood license that we would accept that with reciprocity here in Vermont. And that really expedited folks that moved into the state being able to attain the licensure with the endorsement we needed. They were also revising our ECE and our ECSE competencies. So what that really meant was that for folks that were seeking this alternative pathway to licensure, which essentially is a portfolio option, the work to really streamline that enabled folks to be able to put together portfolios that still represented competencies that were aligned with NAEYC teaching standards, the Division for Early Childhood Specialty Sets, and other recommended practices, but it very much streamlined how those portfolios got put together and how they provided evidence to that, which was a big assistance and help. And then the other thing that AOE did was they added non-traditional hours for the process of reviewing that portfolio. So along with submitting a portfolio for review, professionals have to go in for an interview with a panel on that portfolio. And so, when they started providing Saturday morning hours and things like that, it really assisted the workforce that was working full-time in private programs. I just wanted to throw a slide in here that really highlights that in the last few years, while UPK has really been a driver for us, in addition to that, there are a lot of other initiatives going on in our state that focused heavily on workforce and supporting the workforce. So we had an early childhood summit and also were recipients of Early Learning Challenge Grant dollars, and embedded in that were a lot of projects around strategic investments in people which was code for the workforce. We had a lot of energy and resources going towards systems change, integration, and innovation, and a part of that came down from the Child Care and Development Block Grant reauthorization and focusing on high-quality services, but also our Early Childhood Action Plan that was developed with a variety of stakeholders across the state. In 2015, with the publication of Transforming the Workforce, we had a really hard look at our professional development system delivery model and really transformed that. And it's now completely housed at the beginning of this coming year. It'll be completely housed under our Community College of Vermont and rolled out in a statewide consistent manner. And then, of course, coming out of the CCDBG reauthorization, our new child care and preschool regulations really also supported some movements around workforce and workforce requirements. So our early childhood career ladder, what I really wanted to highlight with showing all of you this is that we've done a lot of work in Vermont to really think about, you know, how does the career ladder, which is really the top part where it's referred to as the Northern Lights career ladder levels, how does it align with all the various systems we have in Vermont that care about workforce? And so you can see in the rows below, our stars is our QRIS that has a staff qualifications arena. Here at the Child Development Division, we have financial recognition bonuses for people that achieve each level on the career ladder. And then within our child care regulations, those in fact are aligned with different levels on the career ladder. So if you teach in the family home, you find you need to have at least a level 1. If you work in a center, so one of our licensed programs, each group of children needs to be led by a staff member who's at least qualified as a teacher associate, at least 75% of the time. So that's the apprenticeship or the associate's degree. And the level that really represents our pre-K teachers that we've been talking about is level 4B. And so that's up above, which is the licensure and endorsement. All that to say, you know, we're making progress. With our new regs, we're requiring individuals to input information into quality and credential accounts that allows us to really beef up the data we have. And as that's been happening, I think you're seeing trend lines here of increasing numbers at each level of our career ladder. I would say to you that some of that is not just people are attaining these levels, but that they've had them and they're now providing us with that information. But, you know, I think in general, what we see right now is more pressure than progress at the moment in these graphs. But the wonderful thing is we are tracking it with data and really starting to pay attention to it in a more concerted and intentional way. And that wraps our piece up. So we're happy to entertain questions that you have for us here in Vermont.
Great. Thank you so much, Melissa and Tierney. This is Claire Irwin. I am the lead researcher for the Universal Pre-K Research Partnership in Vermont. And so I'm here to kind of facilitate a question and answer session. Similar to what Jackie had done earlier with Caitlin, we have not gotten any questions in the chat, and I know I've diligently been pestering all of you during during the webinar, so do feel free to post some questions. I know it's a lot of information to take in, and we're just glad you're here. So, but we do have some questions that came in from registration, so I'll start with those, and then when they start coming in, we'll use those as well. So one question that I had actually that is just a little bit of context in terms of the reach of UPK, Universal Pre-K in Vermont at this time. You had given some numbers. I think it was somewhere around over 8,000 children are being served this year in universal pre-K. Can you give us an understanding of kind of what that is in terms of the percentage of kids who might be eligible to participate?
Sure. This is Tierney, and in the state of Vermont, we average around a 5,000 population per age of child. So if you are
just 2 years. Go ahead.
If you figure 3, 4, and 5-year-olds, that's around 15,000 children, and we have, looking back at the data, almost 9,000 participating in universal pre-K. So that's a little over half.
Yep. The only thing I would say about that is we don't have all 5-year-olds engaging in pre-K because they're actually enrolled in kindergarten. So what we do have as a general rule of thumb is we think we're somewhere between 75 and 80% of uptake right now, Claire.
Okay, great. Great. Yeah, I just wanted to context because Vermont obviously is slightly different than, say, New York State or something like that. So that 8,000, that almost 9,000 does represent a large proportion of the population of kids that we're trying to catch, so that's exciting. So a couple of questions have actually popped in. So one question that's related, I guess, to what we were just talking about is specific to children with IEPs and how many are participating in universal pre-kindergarten.
So we don't, off the top of our heads, know the actual number of children with IEPs that are in universal pre-K. What I can say to you is it's going to be a high percentage. Most of our children that are on IEPs are served in inclusive classroom settings, and that could be either in a public setting or a private setting.
Great, thank you. So Gail has a question here that's related to what you were talking about with the alternative pathways, and she's curious about whether or not that's for employment in districts as well as private programs, or if it's just specific to private child care centers. Or
yes, so the alternative pathways through the Agency of Education, that's an alternative pathway to achieve a teaching license and endorsement. That's actually open to all professionals in the state, and it's not limited just to the early childhood endorsement. That's for all the endorsements that the agency actually issues.
Great. So it's for teacher licensure no matter what, if you're teaching secondary versus early childhood?
That's correct. Each endorsement area has its own set of competencies that a person would need to create their portfolio to be able to show and demonstrate how they have those particular competencies.
Great. So a question that Lynette has is related to STARS, so the QRIS system, whether or not it's voluntary participation or required.
For universal pre-K, in order to be a pre-qualified program in the state of Vermont, participation is mandatory. STARS is sort of the second gateway to become pre-qualified. The first gateway is to have a child care license and have that child care license be active. And the second step is participating in STARS, and that is mandatory.
In general, though, in Vermont, it's not a mandatory system. So any provider that wants to engage in STARS is certainly able to if they are part of our regulated system, but they do not have to.
So I'm going to switch gears a little bit. So earlier you had, in your presentation, you talked about this anecdotal perception that there was a lack of early childhood or licensed teachers to provide the UPK, and then you had done some data collection, which I have to tell you, working for the REL, it's really heartening to hear how Vermont is really using data to inform your work. I think it's really important, and that's really kind of one of the things that we try to do, obviously, as you know, since you partner with us. But it sounds like this pay disparity what is something that may be making it difficult for private providers to attract qualified staff. Can you talk a little bit more about that and about whether, a question did just come in about whether there are financial bonuses for center, program, or individuals, and how Vermont's kind of tackling this potential issue?
So the results from our survey were, in fact, that compensation packages are the most significant barrier in terms of teachers choosing to teach in a private setting versus a public setting. We have two financial incentives that have to do with this. So we actually have a bonus structure for programs as they attain STARS levels. And in addition to that, we have a tiered reimbursement system through our Childcare Financial Assistance Program. So the higher STAR rated you are, the higher your payment from our subsidy program is. And so, what we hope is that does in fact help programs reinvest in quality, which includes compensation for staff. The chart I was showing earlier was really talking about these were bonuses for individuals. So we have a recognition bonus, the dollars that come under this chart, and I just pulled it back up, is really for, that goes to individual folks. So they apply for a level certificate. If they're determined to be eligible for that, then we are able to provide them with that bonus.
Great. That's wonderful. So a question had come in that we asked of Caitlin in terms of how does Head Start fit into the early childhood discussion, and I just wanted to kind of piggyback off that and ask you both the same question, or how Head Start fits into this universal pre-K model within Vermont, or if it does.
So Head Start programs are part of universal pre-K. All Head Start programs are pre-qualified and pre-qualified sites. So they are part of our private center population. We count them in those numbers.
Yep, they also collaborate with public schools as well. So we have what we call combination or collaborative classrooms, where you might have a Head Start teacher and a public school teacher in the same classroom. But essentially, pre-qualification is what we call programs that are eligible to serve children under Act 166. And Head Starts are either standalone pre-qualified because they hold the license, or they may be, in fact, collaborating in part of the public school classroom.
Great. I'm trying to sift through. We don't have any new questions really coming in. Lynn, thank you for responding to some of these questions in the chat. I think it's really helpful to have multiple people on. A question just came in from Mary. So if you pay for 10 hours a week, do the Head Starts add that to a 4-hour day? So I guess the question is, for programs that are full-time, how does the 10-hour per week universal pre-K get worked into that figure?
Yep, so we have actually 7 local Head Start recipients. So the federal dollars go to the 7 grantees, and it looks different in each one. So we're working with the Region 1 office that helps oversee those Head Starts on data and reporting, and our general philosophy is a layering of funds, and not a shifting around. So if our dollars are paying for pre-K, then yep, in some cases, Mary, they do add that to the 4-hour piece. In others, it may be that they're providing, other extras that then get accounted for and reported back to us in an annual reporting mechanism.
Great, thank you. I do want to pause for just a minute. We do have just a few minutes left before we close, and we have a couple more questions that had come in from registration, but if anyone has any final questions for Caitlin or for Melissa and Tierney, please post them in the chat now, and we'll make sure to get those answered. I don't see any coming in right away, but so I mean, I really think we've answered all of the questions that have come in. I think this has been really interesting in thinking about how do we, I guess this idea of having two agencies. So we have the Agency of Education and the Agency of Human Services overseeing universal pre-K, and it's a mixed delivery system. And I think we've talked a lot about what some of those complications might be. Can you guys, before we go to Martha's last question, can you talk a little bit about what's positive about this relationship and how you think it's working well for Vermont?
I think I'll take that. I'll answer that from the family and the children perspective. So our law is a law that covers 10 hours a week, and I think like most other states, many of our families need care for more than 10 hours a week. And so what this has really done is, because we've chosen to go with this mixed delivery system, and really working hard at the agencies to try to bring together the cultures of those two delivery systems, is we've allowed families to be able to seek out the models that work best for them, and we've allowed communities to come together and determine within their communities what are the needs for their families, and where are the gaps, and start to fill that in. So I think that's probably the highlight of the mixed delivery system. Do you want to say anything else?
No, and Melissa, I would echo that as well. I think that's what is positive and works in this co-administered universal pre-K between the two agencies, is that it does provide parents with choice. And so different families have different needs, and some families need full day, full year, 10-hour-a-day coverage, and other families just want the 10 hours, traditional 3 mornings a week pre-K program. So I think that collaboratively the two agencies work really together in supporting families and finding that what works for them and their family.
Yes, and as a parent who takes advantage of universal pre-K in Vermont, I have to agree that I do find that really beneficial. So thank you to both of the agencies for doing such a great job with that. So Martha did just have a quick question, and then I'll turn it back over to Ashley Gaddis, our dissemination manager, to close out the webinar. But she was curious about the high school college to college certification pipeline and how that works. What you can say in a minute, I guess, to respond to that.
Yeah.
So.
Right, go. Actually, maybe a better slide for that is back here. So what I love about our system is, in fact, I guess, this slide, which is it really takes folks. Level 1 is high school graduation, and then getting some fundamentals, just 45 hours maybe of child development. So our system itself really provides a roadmap for people on how to move up through the levels. We have a lot of supports around them. Our Early Learning Challenge grant allowed us to launch our TEACH system, which has primarily been funding in the last couple of years associate degree level folks. But another feature of our system is, in fact, the Childcare Apprenticeship Program. And why that's so important is that it's 6 college credits that's paired with on-site mentoring for professionals. So folks that maybe have never taken a college level course before actually get that with some on-site mentoring and coaching support for that learning, as well as embedding that practice in what they're doing. And what we're finding is our apprentices are transitioning into our associate degree teach model, and they're having the most success because they've had that very intensely scaffolded early on engagement in college courses that then enable them to be more independently successful. So I would say probably that's a big piece of us being able to really have a pipeline that moves people up through our system and on to bachelor's and licenses.
Wonderful. This has been absolutely fantastic, I think. Of course, I'm biased, but I want to thank Melissa, Tierney, and Caitlin for your presentations today. I hope that folks found them informative. And I'm going to pass it over now to our dissemination manager, Ashley, to close out the webinar. So thanks for joining.
Thank you, Claire. I just want to again thank everyone for joining us today for this webinar. As I said earlier, we did record today's webinar, and it will be archived and uploaded to the IES YouTube channel. And when that recording is available, we will send you an email. If you registered for today's webinar, you will receive an email with us with a link to the recording when it is available. And additionally, please don't forget to download today's files. In the Download Today's Files pod, you can have access to the presentation slides as well as copies of Caitlin's index and the executive summary. So thank you again for joining us, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.